officer for Chinese for internment. There are hundreds of stories about these people. There are hundreds of stories about all of our lives. And I'll just quickly look at one, Wei Qi, because he's the man in the funeral, and he's probably one of the most interesting people on the block. His connections with Australia went back to the 1860s or 1850s, I think. And at the time of his death, when he was aged 68, in 1892, he'd been trading in Lower George Street for over 20 years. In the middle of the 1880s, he took out a ground lease on land at 164, 168 Lower George Street. He pulled down all the buildings that were on it and built three houses, and three-house stores with houses above for himself. One of them he lived in, with his shop at ground level. The other two he rented out. He is a substantial Sydney businessman. He also had stores in 4 rural towns, and in addition to operating his import-export business, he supplied those stores and other Sydney stores down in the Goulburn Street area around here with a range of goods. He claimed that about half his dealings were with local traders in Sydney, the rest were with Hong Kong. During 1890, he said that he remitted gold to the value of 10,000 to 12,000 pounds, which is a lot of money, to his Hong Kong trading partners on his account. In addition, he acted as a banker for many of the local Chinese, especially the market gardeners and hawkers who couldn't cope with European banking, sending their money and their gold back to China on their behalf. We know quite a lot about this individual: his trips to China, his wife, his grandson, the fact that he never bothered to learn English, because why did you have to bother? There were so many people down there who could speak Cantonese, and so on, because he gave all this evidence to this Royal Commission, as did a lot of these traders. And as I said, we have that image of his funeral. There's a long description of the funeral in the book. It took 5 hours to go from the rocks up George Street, along Druitt Street, where the mayor came out and gave his respects to this Sydney businessman, and then down back to the docks where there was a feast, and then finally onto the ship and to sail for China for burial. And people said you couldn't get a cab in Sydney that day. You couldn't get a cab for love nor money, because everybody was either at the funeral or angry because they couldn't get through the streets because they were blocked for 5 hours while this whole thing snaked through. So this is a serious presence in Sydney. I can't tell you all about him or about any of these other people in this talk, but I have decided to look a little bit more closely at those people who were making things, the furniture makers. They were in the rocks, as we've seen, and indeed they were in many other places in Sydney as well. They were in Surrey Hills. They were at the end of the 19th century. They were along the Botany Road near the Goyu Temple, which was built for the market gardeners and is still there in the southern end of the city. Yuan Ta employed over 50 men in his factory in Piedmont. So they were scattered all over the city. Chinese craftsmen were making real inroads into the furniture trade, and their furniture was making it into many Sydney houses. And there are many, many images, not so much of the furniture, because a lot of it just looked like furniture, but of the places where it was made. And there it is. It's wash stands and a hall stand leading up there. It's furniture. And that's, somebody said, pointed out, there's a face coming around the corner there, that may well be our furniture maker. It's there's another one. It's hardly a substantial looking place, but with these big bits of timber. I love that one because it's such an amazing photo. Every photograph you see, you've got to learn something else new. I was going to crop out that thing over there because I thought, I don't know what it is. And somebody's bound to say to me, what is that thing, that tall timber building there? So that's one of my research projects for the next few weeks, to try and find out what that is. I left it there because I thought it was really interesting.
It's a drying, seasoning timber.
For timber?
Yeah, because when you cut them, it's white.
Yeah.
I need to stack them up to dry.
That high?
Season. Yeah, well, I mean, probably because then
You
it's
said
by
it so
land.
you get the air.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. See, I thought it was a good idea. You get a free fortune. No, that makes sense, yeah. But it's obviously a Sydney photo there at the back, sitting on the Sydney terraces. I've never seen it in any other photo, but I'm certainly going to look for it now. Yeah. And that's a beautifully evocative photograph of one of the established furniture makers in Surrey Hills. And there are many more images. And I think these people deserve closer study. Our toy, let's get back to him, back down in George Street. We met him earlier on. Our toy employed European workers as well as Chinese workers, and that's something that isn't assumed to often be the case. He was actually married to a European woman who the Royal Commission said was a dreadful old bat, and they didn't know if they said, Arthur was a very nice man, and we don't know how he can put up with it. It's all there. And he used European people to do his deliveries. And one reason why he chose not to have Chinese people but European people delivering his furniture was because his furniture was good, and his clients were a good class of clients, including the upper class department store of David Jones. And that was interesting because the common belief was they just make rubbish. You know, you don't buy their furniture, it's no good. But the snooty people were going into David Jones and buying beautiful pieces of furniture, never knowing that they were made down the road at our toy store. That was a riot at our toys' yards in 1878, where Sydney-siders went berserk and let fly in an outpouring of anti-Chinese feeling. It's 1879. It's a year of high levels of arrivals and high levels of violence against the Chinese. The Chinese in Lower George Street actually petitioned the government about the number of assaults by larrikins. A lot of it was fomented by unionists, and I'm not opposed to trade unions, but I think it is very difficult to argue that the furniture-making trade unionists were not racist, who argued that the Chinese offered lower wages and that their immigration should be restricted. And there was a large anti-Chinese rally against the employment of Chinese seamen coming in on boats, held at Hyde Park on the evening of the 4th of December. And maybe 15,000 people turned up to this anti-Chinese rally. It got hysterical, and when it was decided to march up to Parliament House, a breakaway group headed off down Pitt Street, and at Bridge Street they separated into two groups that rushed into the workshops from two ends, throwing stones at breaking windows and fire torches into the building. There were 50 Chinese men sleeping in the sleeping quarters of the top floor above the workshops. Luckily, those torches failed to ignite. This is horrible stuff. This is horrible anti-Chinese racist Sydney-siders behaving badly. And part of their argument was that they were undercutting in prices. Now, I think our toy must have fervently wished that he'd never put that ad in the paper. The cheapest house in Sydney. Mind you, Wah Hat underneath says he's selling it at lower prices. You know, prices are down and staying down. It's just a common advertising ploy. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't necessarily prove that prices were cheap. And very, very common in all sorts of ads to extol how cheap your goods are. The claim that they were making cheap furniture possibly related to some ends of the industry, as it did the European cheap end of the industry. But it's only part of the story. In the 1879 there was a big international exhibition of manufactured goods in the Royal Botanic Gardens, the Garden Palace, it was called, in Sydney. And at that exhibition, Loom Chiong exhibited furniture which he had made in Sydney. What was threatening about the Chinese furniture makers was not their cheapness, but the very success that they were having in the mainstream economy. Remember the early stuff I showed you, the Chinese goods that were being valued and imported from China. Now things are being made by Chinese people in Sydney, and it becomes a different story. But like those early images of Chinese manufacturers that were integrated or adapted to local needs, those washstands and hall stands you saw, if you'd gone up close to them, they probably had flannel flowers and kangaroos carved into them. They were mainstream furniture. The mainstream unions put out the story that these products were rubbish, that the Chinese paid low wages. And the obvious way, however, to have overcome that problem would have been to integrate the Chinese workers into the furniture unions. But the truth is that on several occasions the Chinese furniture makers attempted to join the furniture makers union and were rebuffed. So it's very difficult to argue that they were not willing to become part of the furniture trade, to abide by the union rules and so on. It's very difficult not to see this as a sheer act of bastardry and racism on the part of the Europeans. Timothy Coghlan, who was the New South Wales statistician in 1891, actually wrote about this in his annual report on the state of manufacturing in Sydney. He said the schedules of price rates were displayed on the windows of Chinese shops. They went to enormous trouble to make sure that they made it very well known what they were charging, so you wouldn't see that they weren't undercutting. He said that several of the Chinese furniture makers had formed their own union. They had had several strikes, resulted in improved pay. And he went on to say there is not such a wide difference as is generally supposed between the wages of the two nationalities. And in the debates in the New South Wales Parliament that eventually led to the Immigration Restriction Act of 1888, which made it more difficult for Chinese people to come, there was a whole lot of racist comments about the otherness of the Chinese, but there were a whole lot of other comments as well, like Ninian Melville, who was himself a cabinet maker and a member of Parliament, said they commenced by making articles that were laughed at, but by perseverance they have infiltrated the whole trade. And Sir Henry Parkes, who was the Premier at the time, offered the observation that it was Chinese skill that was being resisted, not the cheapness of the goods. That's a long, complicated story to in the book. The majority of Chinese were restricted then to market gardening and trading into the Sydney markets. The need for temporary lodgings was followed inevitably by supporting cook shops, grocery stores, pork butchers, places for social gatherings, clan or tong meeting places. There are many stories and there are many images. And those sorts of images tend to be the ones that are sort of stereotypical. That could be a Chinese trader anywhere, market gardener anywhere. That one is definitely in Millers Point, heading towards the Lord Nelson Hotel, which is still there. We met him on George Street North. This is another shop of this trader, and he's obviously selling Chinese ceramics and products in his Surrey Hills store. That was a street that no longer exists, that was totally Chinese in Surrey Hills, near the other side of Belmore Park. Many, many, many images of the Chinese in the 19th century. There was no doubt that they were part of Sydney's community. That's the Chongsang clan meeting held in Dixon Street, photographed by a professional Sydney photographer. Some of the oldest stores of the Wing Sand Company, which was one of the largest trading companies in the Darling Harbour area, and then later on in the the new Chinatown, the Chinatown area that exists today, and that was their more modern store built in the early 20th century. There are images that show the Chinese presence was very much integrated into Sydney's society, right through to the top guy himself, Kwong Tart, who ran some of the poshest tea rooms in Sydney. That's his early shops in King Street, I think, and then he moved into the Queen Victoria building. One of the things about Kwong Tart that is not as well known as other things is that he insisted on paying formal official wages to his staff, and he insisted that they had appropriate holidays and leave loadings and all the things that the unions asked for. But let's get back to George Street and my maps that I love so much. Can you guys see these at the back? We've seen this bit before. You remember that's the western side of George Street, and we've got Wakey of the funeral in the corner here, the Chinese merchant. So you remember that picture. Now let's go further down that side of George Street. We're going back now towards Dawes Point. And there we have, this is George Street's the bottom of the picture there. And there we have the very old firm of Tin War at number 79, with a 3-storey warehouse at the rear. Those numbers say, these maps, by the way, they're fantastic. What they mean is if it's pink, it's made of brick, if it's blue, it's made of timber, if it's yellow, it's whatever. And the numbers tell you how tall the buildings are. So the stores at the back in Mill Lane are 3 stories, okay? That's the warehouse for this trader. The area of this laneway and its various warehouses was used for many years by sojourning Chinese on their way to the gold rushes. So those stores were also tended to be used from time to time as boarding houses. Tin War's shop there at number 79 is there today. It's part of the Rocks. All of those buildings are known as Unwin stores. They were built in the 1840s. They're some of the oldest commercial buildings in the Rocks. It's just a line of shops selling whatever, the Earth collection or whatever, when that photo was taken. But with a little imagination, if you go down there, you can hear the voices of past Chinese. It's been occupied by Chinese since 1861 right up until the 1960s, when the Rocks Authority was established. The names on that shop at number 79 included Nom Hing and Co., Nom War, Sun Hung War, and so on. And from 1877 to 1897, 20 years, Tin War. And we find information about him in the Royal Commission too. But especially go behind into Kendall Lane. What we saw here as Mill Lane has now been renamed as Kendall Lane. Let's get back to the map. If you walk along there and you get to Hop Loon & Co., it's not that anymore, but it was then, there's a street. You just have to walk along George Street up there and into that little laneway, and if you've never been there, you really must go, especially if you're looking for remnants of the Chinese presence in the Rocks. Behind on the store, you can see where buildings have been pulled down. You can see where there were fireplaces and so on, where people who used these areas as boarding houses lived. And in the Tin War building itself is now the Discovery Museum of the Sydney Cove Authority, and I don't work for them, and I'm not particularly giving them a plug, but it's a fabulous little museum, and in it retains some of the Chinese artefacts that were found in that very area, like that very old cooking pot, where you can almost feel it when you go in there. You can see these men either on their way to the gold rushes or single men who come in from the market gardens to spend a night in town, cooking, talking, a very, very Chinese presence.
And if you look really closely at the wall outside of that museum, you can still see tin war code painted.
Can you?
Really faintly, you can still see it on the sandstone.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
In this same run of buildings, for many years there were the stores, the boarding house of King Nam Jan. And if people who know members of the Cummins family today, they are the people who ran that store. Albert Cummins was a very popular and well-known Chinese figure in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and he only died recently. And they were there for over 90 years, and at number 85 until the 1960s. 20 years ago, an old timer who was interviewed, who thought that Mr. and Mrs. Cummins were actually Mr. and Mrs. King, because the store was called King Nam Jan, was interviewed. And I just want to read you a little bit of that interview because it gives you a feeling of this time as late as the 1960s. Do you remember Unwin's store being called Unwin's store, or do you remember them by any other name? What I can remember about that strip was the Chinaman had a laundry, and then there was a little tea shop there, and then there were those big buildings. But then a little further down, this side of the Orient Hotel, was the Chinese shop. That was the Kings. They were Mr. and Mrs. King. And they had all the Chinamen there, and out the back, going into Kendall Lane, they climbed a ladder to come out into the lane because they all used to sleep in that, what would you call it, the basement. They used to sleep there in the basement, and they climbed this ladder and came out in Kendall Lane and would sit there and smoke their opium pipe. Because I know, because I used to go down there and play with Mr. and Mrs. King's little girl. So the memories, the